So we're joined by Andy Knight, who is the Chief Executive of the gas industry company. He became Chief Executive in March 2018. Prior to that, Andy was the Managing Director and Chief Executive of New Zealand Oil and Gas, which is now Echelon, and has held executive management roles with Vector Limited, the National Gas Corporation, and the Australian Gas Light Company and Fletcher Challenge Energy. And is a former independent director of PowerCo and Enzog, and has 15 years of governance experience as a director or chair across a range of sectors, including iwi, private equity, energy, education, government, primary sector, and property entities. We also have, it's hard for Paul to hide. We have Paul Goodeve, who is the CEO of Clarus. Paul is the Chief Executive and he is responsible for the development and implementation of Clarus' strategic business plan. Paul's personable, honest and relatable approach to people leadership has seen him build effective teams and strong and enduring relationships throughout his career working across the energy sector. Paul is a chartered accountant. We forgive him for that, but because he's also a barrister and solicitor of the High Court of New Zealand, which we have to forgive him for as well, because everyone wants more lawyers and accountants. And a member of the Institute of Directors, so that we're okay with the third one. Paul is currently a director of both gas industry company Araaki and Araaki Limited. Paul lives in Taranaki with his family. And then we have another Paul Stocks, who is the Deputy Secretary of the Building Resources and Markets Group at MBIE, which is responsible for many of the regulatory systems that govern New Zealand's markets, including building, communications, competition, consumer and commercial, energy markets, financial markets, intellectual property, and petroleum and minerals. So quite a broad scope. We can ask him anything. The group's role supports a fair, competitive business environment and well-functioning telecommunications, building and construction and resources markets. It also serves as the government's procurement functional leader and the government's property functional leader. Before his current role, Paul was Deputy Secretary for our Labour, Science and Enterprise Group, and as Deputy Director General at the Ministry for Primary Industries. He was responsible for policy and Deputy Director General Strategy and Performance. Paul has had a number of management roles at Treasury, with responsibility for areas including education, market interventions and tax policy. He's also worked at the Ministry of Health and New Zealand Planning Council. So I'd like you to welcome everyone to the stage. Are we getting rid of that? No, I'm making it. Okay, sweet. So my first order of business, can I grab that? So the first order of business.
The first
No?
Sweet. Good. Go.
Is that my work?
Well, let's give it a go. Sweet. Yeah.
Okay. We've just silenced the co-regulator. He's got the silent mic. So first order of the business is to get some commentary from our esteemed panel on John's prognostication of the market. So I was going to start with you, Andy, and then we'll go round to round, and then we'll start with some pithy questions.
I'm thinking this one will probably do it. Yep. Hi, everybody. So a great presentation, John. Thank you. It was interesting when we commissioned John to do some work on LNG back when we did a review of the gas market settings in 2019. And at that stage, we were soundly criticised for even thinking about LNG as a potential solution. And because everyone was thinking about it as a gas solution, but it's not. It's actually an electricity solution. And the real benefit of it will be to take pressure out of the industrial gas market in particular, who are currently bearing the brunt of the fact that there's been hydro and wind shortages. So, as you said, John, there's no surprises there. That's the other thing that I think people haven't worked out often is there was nothing that has happened that wasn't forecast at some point in time. We all knew there was a decline coming. We all knew there needed to be more investment. Most people worked out that at some point the wind mightn't blow. But putting it all together into a system context hadn't been really effectively done. And I think the loss of the discussion around the trilemma had been a significant part of that, understanding that every decision we're making, both as an industry and as regulators, needs to be done in the context of that trilemma, because we've got to be able to maintain an effective cost model for consumers. Otherwise, we burn off too much of the economy. We hurt consumers. The environmental process and decarbonisation, or the transition, however you want to term it, that won't be manageable if we don't bring consumers and communities along. So you've got to maintain that cost side. You've got to be able to maintain the reliability side, because once again, as soon as you start to impact on people's reliability, you start to impact on their jobs, we're going to lose community support. So nothing here should have been a surprise, but everything needs to be put in a system context. We're now in a position where we need to move quite quickly, and we need to be making policy decisions, we need to be making investment decisions quite quickly to be able to look how we get past this period so that we can get into a relatively stable period again, such as we've enjoyed for the last probably 15, 18 years since Pakura came on stream.
You're up.
Yeah, I think it's, it should not be a surprise what happened this year. And I agree with Andy that it is disappointing that so many do think it was a surprise, because we operate an energy system in New Zealand, which natural gas is a hugely important part. LPG is part, liquid fuels are part. And I do worry that the primacy that has been accorded to electricity over the last maybe 8 years, maybe a bit less, has meant that a lot of people have taken their eyes off the interconnectedness of other elements of it. One of the things that was a real indication to me, and I know I spoke to Andy about this, about electricity just not keeping an eye on gas, was the decision of Transpower to shut down EMS Trade Point in sometime about May, just as the gas challenges were presenting themselves. And I was just, if that was the high water mark of electricity, forgetting about gas, I think that was a real clear indication of it. They changed that decision a little bit now, but it was emblematic to me of the fact that electricity forgot about their reliance on gas. I do have a couple of things that I disagree with John. I don't disagree with John about a lot. One of the things that I think your conversation lacks, and it's still a small volume, but it's increasing, is the availability of biogas. And I know I see Elsbetter at the back there, and I know EcoGas have got a project in Reparoa, which is going well, and another project in Christchurch, which is probably a couple of years away, and there are other projects that people are talking about. If you look at some of the European countries and places like that, they have a very substantial component of their gas consumption comes from biogas. And I think that New Zealand needs to open its eyes up a little bit to the opportunities that presents as well. And I would encourage people to think about it maybe not as another field, but certainly as another stream to our gas production. The other bit that I kind of disagree with John on, and I'm developing my views on, I'm not sure if I disagree with you, is you indicate that maybe LNG doesn't work for industrial customers because of the price. I think your chart you had a cross or a question mark beside the price. And I think that that's one of the transitions that New Zealand industry has to make, is we have to think really carefully about how we transition from being an inexpensive energy country to being a more expensive energy country. And there are plenty of countries around the world that run heavy industrial complexes off the back of LNG. Europe kind of worked it out after Ukraine a little bit. And I have some hope, possibly naive, that New Zealand businesses will work out how to transition their products and production to a higher value output, because they need to do that because we no longer have cheap energy in New Zealand, or globally cheap energy in New Zealand. So I think that's something that I think about. I certainly think I think there's a great opportunity for the government to underwrite LNG by signing up all their schools and hospitals to that. I suspect that may not happen, but I think that's an opportunity, Paul. I know you're not in charge of procurement, but maybe... Oh, you're in charge of procurement as well. Oh, just the right person on the stage. And he needs... well, it definitely needs gas. If anyone can afford slightly expensive gas, it's probably the government.
You've been paying attention.
But I think the thing, just to get back to the start, is it is a system, and we need every part of that energy system to work, from the gas fitter and the apprentice program around gas fitters to the drilling, to the transmission and distribution system, the electricity system. All of those things have to play interconnectedly, and I always worry that individual organisations are probably not the best placed people to make decisions about that systematic interconnectivity. And again, sorry, Paul, I don't mean to rain on the government. I also worry that the government is the right person to think about that, but no disrespect to your experience, which is substantial, but what is the deep energy connectivity experience, energy system experience that exists in the government? Where is the 25, 30-year people that have worked across a range of parts of the energy system? Because it does need a national energy system view to work our way through this transition.
Got my own. Cheers. Thanks, Paul. Kia ora. So I'll start with that last point about expertise. Actually, we do have some pretty deep expertise in the ministry on that stuff, but that doesn't include me, because like Angela, I joined at a quite interesting time. I picked up the energy and resources portfolios about 2 years ago. And so that's a really interesting time to join the sector. And I know that briefings to the incoming governments are not on the top of everyone's reading pile, but if you look at our briefing to the incoming government last year, in the context of the energy trilemma, we said that the government and the country's number one challenge was security of supply. And because I always kind of thought, well, the energy trilemma is like a stool. All three legs are really important, they're equal, until you don't have security of supply. And you ask any minister of energy about how they feel about the prospects of the lights going out. And they pale, and they say, how do you stop that? And of course, security of supply feeds directly to affordability. And you see what happens to affordability, and we've seen it this year in industrials, when the cost of energy goes up, and it's a huge input into a bunch of our firms. It is an integrated energy system, so you do need to think about electricity, you do need to think about gas. I do have government procurement. I had a very nervous period this year trying to think about how do we secure supply for schools, for hospitals, etc. One of the reflections I had then is that electricity, in many ways, is a transmission mechanism. Gas is a fuel, and it's non-fungible if you need it. So you've actually got to have it. This year it's been a year, right? It's been a year where we've seen the challenges of dry year, we've seen the challenges of security of supply, and it's you had a government that came in already with quite a clear agenda and policy prescription about what it wanted to achieve in the energy and the resources area. And, we now have a Minister of Energy and a Minister of Resources. They work really well together. And I've now split my teams into one resources team, one energy team, but they work hand in glove. But those immediate pressures has resulted in, a degree of urgency around the legislative and other programs. So we've got the Crown Minerals Amendment Bill in the House, reporting back from Select Committee now. I know not everyone's, 100% happy with some of the provisions in there around decom, for example. And I can't talk too much about that because it's currently in Select Committee, so it's subject to privilege. We've got the Energy Security Response Bill that'll be in the House before the end of the year that does provision for things like LNG terminals in terms of the regulatory settings, things that we can do to make it easier for these things to take place. The Gas Security Response Group that was set up this year with Andy on that as well was actually really important, not just for what it has been achieving, and it's provided us a lot of input into how do we think about LNG, how do we think about CCUS, but actually as a statement about how important it was to get the sector together with government to think about what we needed to do to provide stability, certainty, and responses to some of the challenges that we have. So I think, Government Minister Brown at PACE did say how important he sees and the government sees the sector. I think they've been clear and present and visible demonstrations of that. You see it in the House, you see it in government statements. I know that regulatory certainty is an issue that strikes, deep with the issue. We will do everything we can to provide that regulatory certainty within the constraints of a parliamentary democracy. But it's great to be here, and don't ask me any hard questions.
Yeah, was that a plea or
It was a plea.
Okay, cool. Right. So we've got some excellent questions from Anonymous. So Anonymous has been very prolific. In the meantime, we can remove the lectern if... Yeah. You guys are okay? Because, you can see around it? Yeah.
Steve.
I think we're okay, thanks. So I think we've had a really interesting discussion there, and we've got definitely some good topics to think about. And I think I wanted to kick off with just a dive into, we've got this kind of government needs to put the right settings in place. And so, Paul, I am going to ask you a tough question. If we're looking at energy security, and as I mentioned, we've got to think, Paul's mentioned that we need to think about this as a system, both electricity security as well as energy security. And it really does depend on these kind of high fixed cost, large lumpy assets that are infrequently used, potentially. So how does the government put the right policy settings in place to allow and support investment in those types of assets?
Do you have any of those? Just out of it.
I might have a couple.
Look, I think this is a really important point, and because actually investments both upstream and downstream are large, they are long-lived, and the nature of our energy system means that they're not always required. But making sure that they can wash their face and that people aren't, taking one for the team as they provide supply either of energy or the inputs into that, it's actually really, really important. So one of the things that Minister Brown did last week was issue, for example, a GPS on electricity to the Electricity Authority. And that said a number of things. It said you need to focus on affordability and security. It says the government's not going to step in and cover various players if they don't look after their own interests. And that, by implication, suggests that people need to think about how they're going to cover their forward demand needs, right? And at the same time, you may or may not have noticed that there's been a competition task force established between the Electricity Authority and the Commerce Commission. MBIE's on there as an observer. The reason we're an observer is those two are independent regulators. We can't be seen to be querying the pitch. But as part of that, there are two elements of the work program. The first is looking at the supply side, thinking about how the wholesale markets operate, whether or not there are sufficient accesses to hedges and the incentives are correct. And the second looks at the demand side, including the incentives for consumers to both industrials and domestic to think about their own demands. So I think a bundle of things like that about how the market actually operates are going to be the answer to making sure that all the components of the energy system are appropriately recognised and compensated for. Because if they're not, they won't be there in the long run. And we need them in a really peaky energy system, right? And our energy system, and I keep on talking about energy, not electricity, because it's the whole thing, has been going through, quite a substantial transformation. And in many ways, we've got some settings in play that suited the energy system we might have had 15 years ago. But as we're now moving to a lot more renewables and, the peakiness of that, we are always not always, but I think in the foreseeable future up to 2050, the non-renewable is going to be a really important part of that. What we can do as government is, I think, provide as much certainty we can about the regulatory environment and in many ways that kind of non-discriminatory approach to the inputs to the energy system.
I can see Andy was keen to comment on that.
Yeah. So, back in 2019, the then Minister asked us to do a review of the gas market settings to make sure that they were appropriate for the transition. And we identified two issues. One was the investment in upstream. I think it's pretty well understood, the issues there. And the other was the relationship between electricity and gas. And I often have gas people approach me and say, we're in gas, we're a user of gas, or why do we care about electricity? And the reason that relationship between electricity and gas is so important is that we've had a system that, as Paul said, just got a bit complacent on security because there was a lot of gas. Maui provided a lot of flexibility. Then it was followed on by Pohokura and Mangahewa providing the flexibility, and then Methanex providing the flexibility. So we haven't had that relationship, really appropriate pricing for risk around in electricity. And what that's meant is that we've got the odd position now where, as John said, we're in surplus. We've got a surplus of gas. This week I've had 2 people email me desperate for gas. They can't get gas. And they can't get gas for next year. So we look like we're in surplus, but we also have industrial customers who can't get gas because that gas has been taken up by electricity generators who don't need it. And so we've got something in the system that's not working. And that's the bit we need to work through to solve. And that's a combination. It's not just the government. Paul and his team are working hard at their part. The industry needs to step up collectively to recognise that the industry has a problem and that the industry is the only one, alongside government, that can help solve that problem. And because it's at one level, it is an industry problem, that we have allocation issues where risk and allocation are not being appropriately managed.
Yeah, and so if we think about the regulator, which is yourself.
And Paul.
Oh, no, look, industry co-regulator. So what's your role in all of this, and what are you doing to help bring new supplies to market, and the limitations of what you can do?
So we could do quite a lot. So there's one end where you could put in place a regime where we go through an allocation process and we take gas off people who we think don't need it and give it to people who we think do need it. Now that would be pretty extreme, and in a New Zealand context would be completely out of whack with the way we do most other things in terms of the way we regulate. And
so
we're not proposing to do that, just so we're clear.
I'm a bit relieved by that.
Yeah, but we have looked at it. So we've sat down and said, have we done everything we could do? You're about to get a board paper. Paul sits on my board. Paul's going to get a board paper next week saying that we don't think we should do that because it is too far out of whack. So our role in the moment has been trying to work with government to make sure we're removing all the barriers and that facilitating. And then I've played a role, which is a slightly odd role for a regulator, of trying to work with industry, trying to pull where there are people under extreme stress and match them up so that we can see things going forward. Some of the litigation in the industry at the moment is not helping because it's reduced flexibility for some players. And that's a euphemism, I won't go into it a lot more. But that has made it worse. So, Angela, we're trying to facilitate at the moment. We do have some regulatory tools, but they're pretty limited. The question is, should we have more regulatory tools? Our view is we shouldn't, because we think the industry should step up to resolve this. Having said that, there comes a point in time where if we have regular, prolonged failures of our energy system to deliver to consumers and support our industries, and that's industries who make widgets and dairy and whatever it is, if we end up with continuous failures, then you put the government in a position where they have to respond. And what tends to happen is governments don't tend to respond well, because we have a philosophy in New Zealand that market solutions are better. And we'd much rather see market solutions in place. Government is a very poor executor of reallocation of resource. And we don't want to be in that position, but the industry has to step up to solve this. So it's a combination. It's the big players and the little players.
So I think John would like to talk about the industry response.
I just want to. You're absolutely right, Andy. So this year, the industry. I have to be careful here because there's a number of people in the room with this. But the industry has not covered itself in glory at all this year. The slide I put up before, which is being optimistic rather than confident, are quite different words around the opportunities and the options that are available to the sector to take up in future, they need to be taken up. So things like, if Methanex is going to be able to be offered to demand response into the market, that's all theory. It needs to be done by the sector, and it hasn't been. And these things do need to be. We need more coal in the system, whether you like it or not. That's just a reality. Full stop. And the system the industry has to work together to achieve that. It's not Genesis's job to hold coal on behalf of the country. It's the sector's job to corral arrangements to make sure that there is sufficient fuel in the country to be able to support 750 megawatts of generation when we need it. So it's not all on Paul. There's a lot that needs to be done by the sector. And frankly, I think that, if next year occurs, then maybe it will be all on you, Paul.
But why do you think that? Why do you think it didn't happen this year, John?
That's a really good question. I don't have a good answer to it. I mean, you think about what happened with Methanex. That felt like, was something that came together very quickly and was a sledgehammer that should have been more of a rubber mallet earlier in the year. And we probably wouldn't have ended up in the same place that we did. If we'd had a whole lot more coal in the system this year, we probably wouldn't have ended up in the same place that we ultimately have. Those things take the participants in the sector to arrange. It's not for the government to do. These are options that should be taken up earlier than what they had been. I don't have an answer as to why they weren't.
So my view,
I'm not getting a look in.
My view is that the people who bore the cost of the delayed execution on the deal with Methanex, the people who bore the cost didn't have a loud enough voice. And it was the small industrial gas users. It was the grain dryers who hopefully have just gotten themselves sorted out, but they ran into problems. There was even some of the government contracts. It was some of the small industrial users. They really bore the cost of this year, and some of them are still struggling. Some of them shut down. Now, some of the shutdowns we're seeing that have been blamed on energy supply are actually organisations that are in commodity cycles, and you've got increasing labour costs, increasing energy costs, and you're in a commodity cycle. It's convenient to blame the crisis when the crisis turns up. But that's some of them. There are some businesses that are genuinely on their knees because the deal with Methanex wasn't done early enough, and I don't think they had a loud enough voice.
Right. So hearing all of that, Mr. Goodeve, as someone who looks at long-dated investments and the government saying we're doing all that we can and we're here to help, does that give you optimism or chill?
There was a politician that said the worst things you can ever hear from the government is we're here to help. Or maybe it's a reflection of my political views, but it just puts the heebie-jeebies up me when I hear that. Although that said, I do recognise the government has a really important organisational role. The challenge that I think New Zealand faces with a whole bunch of infrastructure, and probably around the Western world, is that there seems to be an increasing gap between the various sides of the political discussion. So the challenge that we have, and I suspect anyone might have who's making long-term investments, is the current government goes, oh, we're highly supportive, we want to make it work, we want you to get amongst it. And we're going, geez, just about the time we turn soil on this project, there's likely to be a Labour. We're very egalitarian in New Zealand. We give the left 6 years and the right 6 years, and we sort of chop backwards and forwards. Maybe 9 years if they're really good, but we chop backwards and forwards. And so just as I'm turning the sods on the next project, it's going to be a different government. And I know Chris Hipkins has already made some comments about the fast-track consenting process and how supportive they are of that in the future. Not very. I'm not entirely, well, I can surmise what the Greens' position will be on it. So it's very difficult to execute a carbon-intensive project regardless of the current government support with some uncertainty about the next government or the government after that.
Mm. And what's your reaction to that, Paul Stocks?
Was it quite a challenging one for a public servant because, of course, role of public service is to serve the government of the day. And governments are voted in, and they respond to the mandates that have been given. Having said that, we recognise and have provided advice to the government that sovereign risk, which is what we politely refer to it as, is real. It will affect long-run investment decisions. There are challenges in how you respond to that because, again, we live in a parliamentary democracy and there are, people have expectations that parliaments can make laws. So they will do that in the future. Ideally in things that are long-run infrastructural in nature, you really want agreements across the House. That is the domain of politicians, not public servants. But we have also, we've been asked by ministers to give some thought to, are there other mechanisms that can provide greater certainty in an investment climate? So we are thinking about that, but it's tough.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It was an excellent answer because I recognise the difficulty of answering that one. So just coming to some pithy questions from Anonymous, we've got one here that is, while it would be a poor outcome for New Zealand Inc., do you see a scenario where Methanex is encouraged to exit the country, thereby prolonging the reserves picture? And I'll maybe ask John to sort of give your views on what effects that might have on the market and then open it up to others.
Yeah, so there's something here quite a bit, and I'd really dismiss it quite quickly. And the reason for that is that, whether you like it or not, Methanex is the gas sector here at the moment. They underwrite it. They pay for a lot of it. And if they weren't here, then you'd get some drastic adjustments within the sector. So, we've just seen that the sector can't handle what Methanex has got to give, frankly. There is not enough of a market in the sector outside of Methanex to be able to absorb what is on the supply side of the sector. So if you took, say, 40% of demand away from the sector, you would get a supply response. The market would shrink. You would probably see the most expensive fuel in the market move towards decommissioning quite quickly, and that would be Maui. So, this whole thing about spreading reserves across what's left behind, reserves would contract very sharply and very quickly because for reserves to be reserves, you need to define a market for it. If you don't have a market for it, they're not reserves. So it's too simple to say that whatever reserves we have would be just spread across the rest of the market because the rest of the market is too small. So the answer there would be probably you would see a situation where the costs that would be left behind for the system would be higher than what would be the case if Methanex was there, and the cost would be spread across a lower user base, and those costs would be spread and increase accordingly.
I think Andy wanted to have a comment on that too.
I was going to take the opportunity to plug our demand supply report, which will be up on the website in about a month. We do an annual demand supply report. We've actually done
it's an excellent report.
And it is an excellent.
Brilliant.
Andrew was at EY doing it last year. So this year's is nowhere near as good now that you're not there. We've done a Methanex exits early scenario, and it shows that you get a gas window of about 9 months before the deliverability falls so far that you run into problems. So, yep, you'll get a surplus gas on that deliverability side. The reserves come off quite quickly. The deliverability falls quite quickly, and maybe we'll get through next winter. Probably don't need it anyway. It's a capacity problem, not an energy problem. But it's a really short-lived gain.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. Did you have?
I would just add I think Methanex are a fantastic contributor to both New Zealand gas industry and to the greater Taranaki region. I think the way they look after their staff and the way they support community interests is phenomenal, and it will be sad when you see them go. We're talking about it as though it's the gas industry's decision. It's actually going to be Methanex's decision, and so they are, I have no doubt, wherever Stuart or in Canada somewhere, they're sitting down and working out the costs at the moment, and I don't think, just from my supposition, that running one train half the time is actually that great for them. And so certainly when it comes to their next birthday that they need to give the plant, I think it will become increasingly difficult when they look forward. And it's a decision that the gas industry won't make. It's a decision that Methanex will make, and we may be lumped with that sooner than we would like.
So I spend quite a bit of time talking to Methanex about it because we're trying to assess how they... Methanex offer summer-winter plants in other parts of the world. So they already do the service that we're needing them to do in other parts of the world. But as John alluded to, they've now put a lot more flexibility in the way their plant can run. So if and it is a two-way thing, the electricity side of the industry, the thermal generators in particular, need to get to a solution with Methanex that works for both parties that can provide the flexibility that's needed. If we can get that to work, I think Methanex could stay a bit longer and could continue to support security of supply for electricity and gas for a much longer period.
I feel like you're putting a job my way, Andy, in that. But yeah, sorry to use a microphone. I feel that the loss of Methanex would just be a huge loss for our industrial capability and would cut off some zero carbon options later on with e-methanol and other fuels. So, but moving on to LPG, because I think there's been a lot of talk about LPG filling the gap with gas, and I think I'd be really interested to hear the panel's views on how feasible that is and what the limitations of that are.
I came across a customer the other day, an LPG, a gas transmission connected customer, where Paul's gas transmission system was potentially going to lose the customer to Paul's LPG business. So it is happening. I wasn't sure Paul was aware of both of those, but it is happening, and there is some role for it.
Yeah, I think it is a real opportunity. Albert would probably have a better feel for the limitations of New Zealand's LPG importation capacity, but we've still got plenty of room in the system as far as I'm aware. Cost is again always the issue, but if you are a grain dryer with a highly seasonal load, really expensive to supply from natural gas, LPG looks great. And if you're a residential connection, LPG looks good from the distribution and infrastructure aspect because you don't have to spend money to connect them. And I think that's what we're seeing as a lot of investors are looking now is how can I minimise my spend in supporting this customer, because I'm really not sure if they're going to be there for that long. And the regulatory rules in New Zealand mean that if you connect a gas distribution customer in New Zealand, I think it's 56 years till you get your money back. I'm not entirely sure what my view is on natural gas usage in 2070, 80. It's probably less than it is now.
Yeah.
Well, from a government view, we're fuel agnostic. So I think John's, your chart was quite nice. It shows there's a role for every type of fuel in an energy stack, and it's, the right fuel for the right purpose. So what we've not heard is that there's any barriers in a regulatory sense for LPG. Our focus is making sure that the rules of the game facilitate the production to take place and the use to take place. And unless we hear otherwise, we think that's pretty much taken care of.
Anything from you, John?
Not really. LPGs it's such a versatile fuel. You can do so much with it, and it's not. It is storage. It's not deep storage in the same context of what LNG is, and that's quite a specific use case there. But we continue to be really surprised by just where it's turning up around the place, including just bleeding into the natural gas system. To be able to beef up natural gas when we're short, which we are at the moment. It's a really versatile fuel.
One of the things that I think when we talk about security, we also have to think about resilience. So one of the challenges the natural gas system has at the moment is everything's in Taranaki here. If there were, heaven forbid, to be a volcano, that would be kind of challenging. What we saw in Cyclone Gabriel and a lot of the work that companies like Algas and Rock Gas, and I'm sure OnGas did as well, was supporting the energy needs of relatively disconnected parts of the community. And I think that as we think about our energy, I think resilience and obviously energy sovereignty is another watchword. But if we think about resilience, I think LPG is a hugely important part to play in that sector.
Yeah. So we're going to change one letter here and go back to LNG. And I've got a question here about the flexibility of the LNG option And is New Zealand's demand large enough to just dial up a ship when we need it?
We're doing quite a bit of work at the moment on the LNG demand, and you can break it into periods. So there's a period from now till probably when Methanex winds down, and whenever that is, where the LNG demand will be very low if the arrangements get sorted out. But there is a period after that potentially where the LNG demand picks up a bit. At the most, our analysis says that in the next 10 years or so, the most you would ever need, even with dry and less low wind, would be 2 or 3 cargoes a year. So it's the economics of it on a per gigajoule basis are going to be pretty challenging. We think that there has to be a new mechanism put in place for the electricity sector to effectively underwrite the infrastructure investment. So the infrastructure investment will be some pipes, a connection to a ship, possibly even a vessel that sits there. If that's your basic infrastructure, that's going to have an annual cost. That annual cost will be whatever it is, and I've had numbers put to me as low as 40, 50 million US to 80, 90, 100 US a year. If it's in somewhere in that range, how much can the electricity sector afford to pay for their security of supply? Yeah, they charge their customers 9, 10 billion a year. They can probably afford 15, 20. The question is, can they get it done?
Can consumers afford to pay that?
Can consumers afford to pay it? Will consumers have to pay it, or does that get borne by the electricity generators?
Yeah, shots fired. Are you willing to go into that, Paul?
I think LNG is a tremendous opportunity for New Zealand. I mean, in some ways, if we spoke a little bit about energy sovereignty, it's not great from that perspective. But what we've seen with LPG is it's seen none of the challenges that natural gas has seen because it's fully connected with an international commodity trade. And I think that is the advantage of LNG, is it connects New Zealand with international prices. Now that probably brings higher prices, but it also brings certainty of supply. The one thing though that we do have to be cognizant of is New Zealand is not on any major LNG supply routes. We are slightly left of where all the action kind of happens, or right probably of where all the action happens in the world. So that is not going to be simple to solve to get the product here when we need it, but it's not unsolvable. It's just slightly challenging.
So I'll go back. I'm always referencing your work. I'll go back to that option. It's an optionality issue, right? And having the more options you have available, the better it is to your thinking about how you use your stack. The government's been pretty clear that it's supportive of making sure that anything it can do to make those options more viable and realistic will be there. You know, the fact that there'll be a bill introduced into the House before the end of the year on energy security, which looks at basically saying, once industry works out how and when and if they want to do an LNG import terminal, we'll look after the consenting issues. You know, that's a pretty strong signal about, how the government's facing it. That doesn't mean the government's going to pay for it, just to be absolutely clear. But again, if I look at that GPS on electricity, some pretty clear signals in there about the expectations around the market participants to make sure that they have thought about security of supply and the consequences of not doing that. And the government's approach here is make sure the market rules are working properly and let that flow.
So just following on that, we've got a net zero 2050 target, which is bipartisan support for. LNG in some has been quoted as more carbon intensive than coal. So how is that consistent with that net zero target? You can, yeah. Is it consistent?
Yes. So the government and both sides of the House are committed to the net zero target. But like any country, that is not going to be a straightforward or an easy target to meet. And the challenge is you can't really look at one fuel source or one input or one industrial activity in isolation of a system as a whole. So yes, there are carbon intensities around it, but actually, the alternatives of not having supply is that yes, you'll meet your emissions targets because you start having industrial shutdowns. So it's not actually a really easy circle to square, circuit to square. But it's one that, we are working on, and the emissions reductions budgets, are showing us meeting it tight, but we're working on that.
Right, that's cool. So if we just go back to the consumer angle on all of this, because we do have to remember that we serve the consumers, and we have been, we've obviously seen huge variability in gas supply, and an inability of customers to get gas connections, and that's at the local level, and the inability of customers to get gas supply. So what does that say to consumers, and what impacts do you think that's going to have on gas needs in the industry going forward?
It has continued to surprise me at how strong the growth in gas connections has been for the last 7 or 8 years. I think consumers are concerned about their exposure to high gas prices, but the ones I talk to go, well, at least it's not as bad as electricity. And maybe that's just because there's a little bit more transparency about the electricity prices, and as far as I'm aware, no domestic consumers are exposed to electricity spot prices. So I think consumers are still connected with gas but worried about supply going forward, and certainly those mid-size industrial, large commercials are being very heavily exposed to it. But then there are also some electricity retailers who said they weren't taking any new customers either. And I think this is probably something that I would suggest that maybe the government needs to think about. What happens if no one takes any customers? What happens in that last resort thing? Because we face that quite regularly. Well, we may face that increasingly. And so commercial government-owned entities make decisions that are in their commercial interest, but not necessarily in the interest of New Zealand consumers. And that's perfectly understandable, but it does raise challenges.
Yeah. So we had a period of about 3 or 4 weeks this year where there were people moving into houses in Auckland, and they'd sign up with their friendly electricity retailer or their friendly energy retailer, and we shouldn't call any out, Angela, but they and they weren't able to get gas. They moved into their first home, probably a Kiwi build, and they'd gone in and there were gas appliances and they couldn't get gas. No one would retail them. So it went on for about 4 weeks until the retailers started to play ball. And now if you turn up and you just want a gas connection, it's going to be pretty tough as a residential. But if you want a bundled product set, then then most of them are offering the bundled product set. Some of the gentailers are still not taking new gas connections, even as part of the bundled. Now, that is quite disturbing because it's obviously not a gas issue. Although I did bail one of the CEOs up this week and he said, no, it's a gas issue. I don't think it's a gas issue. I think it's actually something more systemic around the way that those organisations see the transition working. And that's part of the industry needing to coordinate and have a really clear view as to how the energy transition is going to work, what the energy strategies are, and how the system is going to move itself forward.
Any other comments on that? Because that sounded like a call for an energy strategy. Have we got one coming up, Paul?
So it's something we've been discussing with the Minister. I mean, the thing about the energy strategy is that if you piece together what ministers have said, it'll be pretty clear about what this government's energy strategy is. It may well be, though, that putting that in one place with a stamp on the top that says this is the government's of New Zealand's approach to energy actually has value, and it might have value to the participants in this room, to international investors, to others. If we do one, it won't be a lengthy one. It'll be relatively short and sweet. We're not being paid by the word. So I think that's valuable. I just come back to this issue about connections as well. Government's not great at doing a number of things, allocation of resources and other things. What we do try to do is make sure that markets are operating effectively. And where you see markets not operating effectively, you inevitably get consumers and others saying, hey, what's going on here? And so, my general approach to that, and got other portfolios as well, is that markets are made up of individuals, of companies, firms who collectively make a bunch of decisions, and generally they work well. If they stop working well, that puts enormous pressure on governments to do something. So I just echo Andy's comments, and actually the comments we heard this morning, that this is a sector that has to operate together on these issues, and it's not something government can come in and kind of solve, or you don't want it to anyway. Yeah.
No, well, I think that's been a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed the openness and the expertise that we've had on the stage. I can see that morning tea's arrived out there, so I'll draw it to a close there, and I want to thank our panel for their excellent contribution.